Hello. Welcome back to another Geopolitical Futures podcast. We've been off for a while, but we're really excited to be back. When I say we, of course, I mean me, Cole, and Jacob. Jacob, say hi.
Hi.
Where you been, man?
I've just been here in Texas doing some writing. I was in Nashville, Tennessee for a couple days as well.
How was Nashville?
You know, I think the southeast of the United States could really use some better transportation infrastructure. I would like to put a request out there to the Chinese to bring One Belt, One Road funds to the United States to build high-speed trains. Wouldn't that be nice?
And I'm bored already. So let's go ahead and move on from that. We've got kind of an interesting show for you today. We're coming at you late. There was Memorial Day weekend last week, so we're already on kind of a truncated week. It's Wednesday at time of recording. We've got several things that we do want to share, and we'll get to each one of them individually. It's going to be George, and it's going to be Phillip Orchard, our Asia analyst, and Xander talking about different things. So, Jacob, do you want to introduce George's segment first?
George, right now, I should say, is in Budapest,
yes,
speaking at a conference, as he is wont to do. And he met with one of our partners from the Casimir Pulaski Foundation, and they're having a conversation about wargaming, because George is a wargame nerd, as we've even done a podcast here together playing a wargame, and Jacek is one of the brightest minds about geopolitics in Poland that there is. So they're having an interesting conversation about wargaming and why wargaming is relevant to policymakers and also just, people who are interested in geopolitics today.
Okay, well, without further ado, let's roll it.
Hi, this is George Friedman, and I'm here with Jacek Bartoszek, who heads up wargaming at the Pulaski Institute in Warsaw. And we happen to be having this discussion in Budapest, so that should make it exotic enough. Having been engaged in making wargames, I'd like to ask Jacek to give us a definition of wargaming, aside from a tool to increase defense budgets.
That's a tricky question, very difficult to answer. I think that this is the wargaming itself, or wargame, is a very good mechanism to many times check the patterns, how terrain and particular geography and its constraints influence, impact the correlation of forces and strategic thinking that, in my opinion, always stem from geography.
I'm quite serious about the introduction. It was meant as a joke, but the more effective the war game becomes, the more influential it is, the more political pressure comes on wargamers. So that, for example, in the South China Sea, which you wrote a book about, there's tremendous pressure, sometimes not to show strength in the war game, but weakness, so you can make a claim for budgets. So not that the U.S. Navy would ever do such a thing, but assuming it would overemphasize the other side, and then the wargaming becomes corrupt. So one of the things I've always thought about is the idea about removing control of the wargame from the government to people who have absolutely no influence on the budget or anything else, nor can be pressured. And that's not criticizing the military. I mean, we all want to have more resources. We all want to use the tools that are there. In Poland, do you see war games used in that way at all?
I agree that the potential spreading of technology or wargaming habits will increase the awareness and also increase the level of debate about the strategic challenges facing at least Intermarium or Poland, that is located where it is, between the European Peninsula and Russia, between the sea powers and land powers. That the more you play and the more people are involved and they are not subdued by their principles, I think at the end of the day, the better pattern is reflected in their repetitive behaviors, which in my opinion is in good national interest.
The Polish government has access to JTILs and is playing it. They're obviously classified, what they do. But we know also that you've run war games of your own that are unclassified. How do you read the military correlation of forces at this point between Poland, for example, the forces that are present from the United States in Poland and the Russians.
This correlation is very peculiar, as the real Polish war theater is divided into three separate sub theaters, and they do not match the political divisions. I mean, the Baltic states are in a sub theater that is the least important from the Polish national perspective and security issues. The most important is the Belarusian corridor leading to the Smolensk Gate. And Belarus is, of course, out of the NATO, out of the game. And because of the political constraints, it is not conceptualized enough how to address the issue of power projection capabilities of Russia emanating from this country, and also the Polish behavior to that, not to mention NATO behavior, United States behavior. And south of the Polessia swamps, the marshes, huge marshes, is Ukraine. This is the third theater of operation and is expanding to the Black Sea and to the behind the Dnieper River and the Donbass. Those, from the Polish perspective, those are three complete areas, completely different areas. And the NATO itself is only in one of it, which means that for Poland, it's the whole Eastern Front that is in one place, and we need to take it into account, with a direct challenge to Warsaw emanating directly from the east, not from the Suwałki Gap, from the Baltic states. But that is driving a wedge in our thinking about the unity of NATO. And wargaming is proving it.
From a geopolitical point of view, the key to the entire situation between the European Peninsula and Russia is Belarus now. The Ukrainian situation is such that it's essentially stable in a sort of unstable way. The Russians have what they want, a buffer from the West. The Western powers have what they want, a buffer from the East. So it's a neutral zone. The Baltics are part of NATO, and the last thing the Russians want to do is reunite NATO. And an attack on the Baltics would, of course, be one of the few things that could do that. Belarus, standing between the Baltics and Ukraine, becomes critical. It is the last piece of the buffer that the Russians have at least vaguely friendly to them. Ukraine is hostile, the Baltics are hostile. If either side tipped the balance in Belarus, or if internal forces in Belarus tipped the balance toward or away from Russia, the other side would have a tremendous difficulty. Because at that point, if it was pro-Western, suddenly Smolensk would be a border town. And this was the heartland of the Soviet Union. From the Western point of view, if the Russians tilted it, suddenly the front in Poland would be much broader and much more vulnerable. So this is a country that few people focus on right now. And I think both sides kind of wanted to stay that way. But one of the things that geopolitics tells us is if there's going to be trouble, it will start in Belarus. What wargaming tells us, it is a very difficult country for us to defend Poland because the topography is an open door, but it's an open door the other way. So this is the point to really look at. You said before that the Baltic countries are not very important. Having been to the Baltic countries recently, they would take polite issue with you. I don't know how polite it would be. From their point of view, they're the blocking force. So the argument from the American side for not having forces there is forces would be in Poland and move at their flank. From their point of view, thank you very much for leaving us this way. I mean, if a Lithuanian came and heard you speak, how would you answer him after he got through saying those things?
I think that in reality and in truthness, they know it. As for the last 500 years, all the wars that were waged on the Eastern Front, and Poland has had around 20 of them with Russia. It was not about the Baltic states. The most important direction was Smolensk Gate direction. It's a rolling flat terrain, perfect for tank, quick, rapid even movements, flanking movements, not so many barriers. The terrain is channeling the movement onto Warsaw. And if you hold this passage between the Dnieper and the Dwina rivers, leading to the Smolensk Gate, a key critical point, then you hold Moscow by neck, and the Russians know it. So there were so many wars about the Smolensk Gate on deciding the fate of Eastern Europe. Uh, and actually, you can't enumerate too many regarding the Baltic states. It's a political dimension. It's a political dimension. Three Baltic states look like islands connected to the bulk of the NATO countries through the narrow land bridge called Suwałki Gap, controlled by Poland. And in that respect, Poland is the center of gravity of the NATO in Europe, and making NATO viable and sustainable in case of any contingency. And because Belarus is also important, and Ukraine, as we mentioned, is also important, and we all have borders with those. Poland has borders with those countries. So for those three reasons, different in kind, Poland is so important as a center of gravity, as I said, from which you spread your forces, you project power. This is the area of entry of U.S. Surge in case of contingency, of course, facing the anti-external capabilities of the Russian side. So there are many challenges and obstacles to overcome, but the Polish territory will become a critical element of the whole architecture.
If I play the Russian side, there's one thing I notice. NATO was about 1,000 miles away from St. Petersburg in 1990. With Estonia in NATO, they're less than 100 miles away. So if I'm a Russian and I look at the map, I say everything you said is true. But a thrust, if they ever were to build up, northward would put the second largest city of Russia in checkmate, one that went through a long siege. So there's asymmetry in interest. Not that they aren't worried about the Central Front, they are, but that they also have to be worried about the northern. You, on the other hand, Poland and the United States have minimal concerns about that because we don't intend to attack. But let me ask by the obvious question for any such discussion to finish with. Okay, so we're talking about NATO. Well, I know what the United States is doing, and I know what Poland is doing. I know what the Romanians are doing. What is NATO doing? What is the Polish read on NATO?
I think that we think that NATO is the United States, bluntly speaking. And if we take a look at real assets and resources that are needed to help us in contingency on the eastern flank, actually it's all about the US power projection capabilities that are also questionable in certain aspects, given that they need to get deep into the continent, far away from the open Atlantic, through the Danish Straits. Given the anti-external capabilities, there is a question of Germany and its political attitude towards Poland and NATO on the eastern flank. There are many aspects that complicate this matter. And coming back to your question about Russia and its proximity of Petersburg to Estonia, yes, if you take a look at the grand picture, especially from the historic perspective, Russia is vulnerable, and they are right now in the position of weakness. Petersburg, open access from Estonia. Small Belarusia is actually in their hands. It is true, somewhat, but that's the last missing piece from the intermarium, traditional intermarium. If Belarusia were not in Russian hands, the whole intermarium bloc of countries stretching from the Baltic States to the Black Sea is sort of containing Russia. And this is a very vulnerable position. From the Smolensk Gate, you can really reach Moscow quickly, as all wars from Napoleon, Swedes, Poles, and Hitler proved. And also, take a look at Ukraine. It's a very big country with strategic depth. Assuming that the Donbass is inside Ukraine, and there is this Kiev region, you can project power into the Volga river system, into the Kursk region, to same rivers, to further into even Rostov, which is the sort of a heartland of Russia. You can theoretically, looking at this map from the Russian perspective, and I know that they think in this way, you can cut off Caucasus from the Volga river system from the if you attack from the Donbass. So they must feel very vulnerable, and very sensitive about encroachment, so to speak. Belarus their victory, so to speak, so far. We'll see how it evolves. From the Polish national interest, this is a critical element. This buffer zone is of critical importance for the future.
But it has to be remembered always that a weak, once powerful man may not have the judgment we hope he has. This is what Russia's now been reduced to. It had once been a power that the world trembled in front of, and now they are on Facebook. So we would also look at that as it is not to underestimate the Russians. They're serious and playing a very good hand. A weak hand, but a very good one. So we have to look at it in this way, and also to remember there's another entry to Russia, which is the Caucasus. And the Russians are hanging on to the North Caucasus for dear life. Dagestan, Chechnya, Abkhazia, South Ossetia. I mean, this is the other entry. So there are two entryways into Russia. They have one secured for the most part, the Caucasian one, but unsecured. And they feel very, very vulnerable. They see every American move into Poland as increasing the pressure. We see their maneuvers around Belarus as increasing the pressure. It's not a Cold War, but it's not a warm, fuzzy feeling. And so, combining geopolitics and wargaming gives you an interesting idea, which is that, hey, watch Belarus. This is the place to watch. Jacek, thank you very much.
Okay, well, that's all for George and Jacek. Next, we're going to take it away from Eastern Europe and war games and ethereal abstract things. And Cole, we're going to listen to Xander Snyder talk about the Libya model. Is that right?
Yeah, the summit between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un was on, now it was off, and now it's back on again. And we don't really know. It's all tentative. We think it's going to happen, and it might not. But one of the refrains you keep hearing out there is Libya model, and I want to sort of clear up any confusion as to what that might be. It really just entails like the way a regime denuclearizes, right? I don't want to give too much away. I don't want to steal Xander's limelight too much. So let's just roll that clip that he recorded on his own volition, yeah?
So the big news of the day is President Trump canceled the U.S.-North Korea summit. Although he did leave open the possibility that some sort of talks may occur later, and essentially told Kim Jong-un to make him an offer, and the idea of talks could be revisited. This came after Kim Jong-un canceled a meeting that was planned with South Korea, supposedly citing the U.S.-South Korea military drills that were ongoing, but that were already scheduled when Kim Jong-un proposed the meeting with South Korea in the first place. Now, at this time, Kim Jong-un had also threatened to cancel talks with the U.S., but still hadn't when Trump made his announcement. So there's a lot of back and forth to follow here. But one phrase that keeps popping back up into the conversation is the Libya model. So what is the Libya model? And why is a North African country relevant to events that are going on today on the Korean Peninsula? The former dictator of Libya, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, initiated a nuclear energy program in the late 1970s. After purchasing some lightly processed uranium and the completion of a nuclear research reactor that was built in Libya by the Soviet Union, Libya then began looking into further enrichment of both uranium and plutonium in the early 1980s, both of which can be used with sufficient enrichment for nuclear weapons. Libya accelerated its uranium enrichment activities in the mid-1990s. By 2000, the U.S. had obtained intelligence reports indicating that Libya did in fact have an active nuclear weapons program. After secret talks were held between the U.S. and Libya, Libya agreed to renounce its weapons of mass destruction program, its nuclear weapons program, in exchange for the lifting of sanctions that had been imposed by the U.S. and the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council lifted its sanctions first in 2003, and the U.S. lifted most of the remaining sanctions that it had outstanding in 2004. Now, at the time, John Bolton, who was then the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security Affairs, claimed that Libya gave up its program, its nuclear weapons program, after witnessing the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which he had said sent a strong message to Gaddafi. Others believed that Gaddafi gave up his nuclear weapons program primarily for the sanctions relief. Now, the relevant point for the current conversation about North Korea, it doesn't really matter why Gaddafi gave up the weapons program. It just matters that he did. Because less than 10 years after giving up his nuclear weapons program, and in the wake of the Arab Spring, a number of anti-Gaddafi protests gave way to an uprising that then turned into a civil war. Gaddafi responded by killing protesters and instructing the military and hiring mercenaries to essentially engage in indiscriminate retaliation against civilians. A movement was formed that was led by the United States and France to intervene in order to stop these civilian deaths. So after a vote in the UN Security Council, NATO intervened, along with a number of Arab countries. And this intervention was essentially led primarily by the United States. First, a no-fly zone was imposed to limit Libya's air force from conducting strikes on rebels and civilians, but the coalition force also conducted airstrikes against Gaddafi regime targets. The net result of this was rebels began to gain the upper hand and ultimately captured and killed Muammar Gaddafi. So when John Bolton mentions the Libya model, he's referencing a full and largely immediate end to weapons programs, or a weapons program. Now, when North Korea looks at the precedent of Libya, it doesn't see a particularly reassuring example, because North Korea sees a regime that was essentially anti-US that for a while seemed to be working its way towards having an effective nuclear deterrent, give that up, and less than a decade later suffer deposition at the hands of the United States and an international coalition. So North Korea undoubtedly sees this in part due to the willing abdication of an effective nuclear deterrent against U.S. intervention. So instead of a full and immediate end to its nuclear weapons program, which is essentially the U.S.'s position right now as a precondition for even entering into negotiations, North Korea instead wants a phased approach, which would essentially let it drag things out, let them work in fits and starts, and essentially keep buying time. Clearly, these two positions, that of the United States and North Korea, are in conflict with one another, which is why the Libya model, the Libya precedent, is so concerning to North Korea and why it contributed to the breakup of the proposed talks. If you're interested in learning more about what happened in Libya and how Muammar Gaddafi came to power and subsequently lost it, be sure to check out our weekly graphic at www.geopoliticalfutures.com. And for a deeper grounding in the geopolitics that are shaping the contours of this negotiation process, be sure to check out our reality check from Friday, May 25th.
So yeah, hopefully that kind of clarifies some of the confusion that's going on between, what denuclearization means for Kim Jong-un, what denuclearization means for the United States, and why that definition is actually really, really important, because Gaddafi's dead, right? So you can't blame somebody for not wanting to die, right? Last but not least, we're going to move on to a recording Phillip Orchard did about a week or two ago. Jacob, can you fill me in on this?
Yeah, so this was actually recorded right after elections in Malaysia brought an opposition party to power. The surprising result has geopolitical implications, because it means that Malaysia, which, because of various things that Philip will go into, was looking more friendly towards China as a potential partner, this opposition victory seems to be turning Malaysia away from China at a time that China is certainly desirous of new friends and strategic partnerships. So Philip will help us understand the labyrinth of Malaysian politics and what's at stake here.
A single coalition, known as the Barisan Nasional, has basically ruled Malaysia since independence in 1957. But over the past few years, the government had become embroiled in a massive corruption scandal, a scandal that led it to face accusations that it was selling out Malaysian sovereignty to China. And in general elections, against all expectations, the government got utterly trounced. So was this the Malaysian Spring, as some in the media have taken to calling it? A triumph of democracy, with the voters holding a nakedly kleptocratic regime to account and bucking a region-wide trend toward authoritarianism? Well, sort of. But there's a twist. Actually, several twists. There are three main figures to know here. The new Prime Minister is 92-year-old Mahathir Mohamad. Mahathir was actually Malaysia's Prime Minister for 22 years, from 1981 until 2003, and is a singularly dominant force in Malaysian political history. So the election could perhaps best be described as out with the old, in with the, well, older. Mahathir had his own authoritarian streak when in power, often using draconian measures to silence dissent and sideline rivals. But he's fondly remembered by many in Malaysia as the one who made the country the moderately prosperous place it is today. The guy he defeated, Prime Minister Najib Razak, was once his protege, but the pair had a falling out after Najib became Prime Minister in 2009 and began eradicating Mahathir's influence in their party. Now, to defeat Najib, Mahathir had to team up with another former protege turned rival, Anwar Ibrahim. Anwar was Mahathir's heir apparent until 1998, when the pair had an even more dramatic falling out. Since then, and here's where it gets really fun, Anwar has been jailed twice on sodomy charges that are widely believed to be politically motivated, once by Mahathir, and again in 2015 by Najib. Anwar has been the face of the opposition ever since, and he's expected to get a pardon eventually, but he had to celebrate the big win last week under lock and key. The twists and turns of this power struggle could fill 3 seasons of a binge-worthy drama on Netflix. But does any of this matter geopolitically? To start, it raises questions about Malaysia's relationship with China. Part of what led to Najib's downfall was a massive scandal related to a sovereign wealth fund known as 1MDB. The fund was supposed to be used to finance strategic investments in infrastructure development. But, as it turned out, much of it was used to finance a spending spree by Najib and his associates on luxurious assets abroad. All told, nearly $4.5 billion is believed to have been pilfered off and laundered through a maze of shell companies. In fact, some $700 million made its way into the Prime Minister's personal accounts. Najib claimed it was a political donation from friends in the Middle East, and he claimed he repaid it. To stabilize the fund and put the scandal behind him, Najib turned to China, selling off assets owned by 1MDB at pretty favorable terms and getting the Chinese to agree to take on some of its debts. All the while, massive Chinese investments came pouring into rail, ports, and real estate projects. Naturally, this led to accusations from Mahathir and others that Najib was selling out Malaysian sovereignty for political gain, and certain big-ticket projects became major campaign issues. Since winning, in fact, Mahathir has pledged to review all contracts signed with Chinese firms. The worry in Malaysia, as in many countries where China is investing heavily in Belt and Road projects, is that Beijing is using investment as a tool to win support for strategic issues, such as the territorial dispute in the South China Sea. Malaysia, of course, is a party to this dispute, and it has been conspicuously quiet in recent years on the issue. Still, there's no direct evidence that 1MDB was why Malaysia has stayed pretty quiet about the South China dispute or other points of contention with Beijing. Like most countries in Southeast Asia, Malaysia is keen to hedge its bets and avoid decisively backing either China or the US and its allies on the issue. In fact, Malaysia has remained broadly friendly with the US throughout this time, even though US media and the US Justice Department played major roles in exposing the 1MDB scandal. There's also little evidence to suggest that a backlash to Chinese investment was what swung the election. For various reasons, Barisan Nasional's edge has gradually been eroding over the past decade, and anecdotal reports suggest it was Mahathir's enduring popularity was what was enough to put the opposition over the top. The maxim that all politics is local may be trite, but it also happens to be true. The scandal will heighten scrutiny over the next government's ties with China, and Beijing certainly prefers dealing with stable autocrats than the messiness of more robust democracies. But there's no reason to think political forces will snuff out Chinese money or influence in Malaysia altogether. The reality is Malaysia will still need China, especially if Mahathir's government wants to live up to all the expensive campaign pledges it made over the past year. The new government is also inheriting sizable debts incurred by Najib's government ahead of the election. For the time being, Malaysia is going to be overwhelmingly inward-looking. It's going through an unprecedented transition of power. Deeply entrenched patronage networks will need to be unwound. Political scores will need to be settled. The new governing coalition will struggle even to stave off chaos within its own ranks, given that it's a fractious, multi-ethnic coalition united primarily by the desire to oust Najib. Most of the winning coalition distrusts, if not despises, Mahathir, and there will immediately be internal power struggles over cabinet posts and pressure on Mahathir to keep his tenure short before handing the reins to Anwar. This environment may open new avenues for influence to nimble outside powers, but as a whole, Malaysia will have little ability or appetite to dramatically change its geopolitical orientation on its own.
Okay, great. Thanks for bearing with us and listening to all those little hodgepodge recordings we had done. Hopefully you liked it. If you do, let us know. And if you don't, let us know, I guess. Jacob, do you have anything else before we go?
I'll just take my prerogative here to wish my condolences to all Houston Rockets fans out there. I am not a Rockets fan myself, but man, that was tough to watch.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up because it's heartbreaking. There's a little bit of schadenfreude, I know, but going 0 for 27 on three-pointers is... 538 broke it down. I think it was 1 in 72,000 chance that actually happens.
Well, yes, and this allows me to make this geopolitical as I want to do.
Oh, God.
It is very rare that you get to watch something happen that only has a 1 in 72,000 chance of actually happening, and it is a good lesson because it can happen not just in basketball. It can happen all over the place. And while you're thinking about contingencies and things that are happening in the world, just remember that sometimes everything you think is possible, things might go off the rails.
Yeah, and then change comes slow. It wasn't that long ago that Golden State was not. It was a joke. It was a joke of an organization. They were not respected at all, and now they're a powerhouse. Just all of a sudden, it wasn't overnight. It was the slow buildup of different capacities, right? But now we find ourselves where we were last year, and the year before, and the year before. We've got Cleveland versus Golden State, and Golden State's probably going to win. And it breaks my heart to say it, but it's true. All right, on that note, we're going to go. Bye.
Bye.